All right, welcome to This Explainer. If you're gearing up for your strategic business exams, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're not just going to sit here and memorize textbook definitions. No way! We are going to dissect real-world corporate disasters, essentially performing a disaster autopsy, and figure out exactly how to prevent them. This is your ultimate exam-focused playbook for understanding corporate risk. So, let's just dive right in.
$18.5 billion. Take a second to let that number sink in. That is the staggering, catastrophic fine BP agreed to pay after the 2010 Gulf of Mexico oil spill, 11 lives tragically lost, and almost 5 million barrels of oil spilling out over 87 days. And here's the real kicker. A White House commission actually found this wasn't just some freak unpredictable accident. It was the direct result of cost-cutting measures and weak safety systems. That $18.5 billion price tag, it proves without a shadow of a doubt that risk management is absolutely not just some boring administrative chore. It is a high-stakes, literal life-or-death corporate survival skill.
And BP? They are definitely not an isolated incident. Let's zoom out a bit. Back in 1995, Barings Bank, which was the oldest British merchant bank, literally got wiped out by a massive £821 million loss from just one rogue trader, Nick Leeson, all because he was allowed to control both trading and settling. Then jump to 2008. The complete failure to grasp the true risk of subprime mortgages bankrupted absolute titans like Lehman Brothers. Or how about 2018? The UK's National Health Service took a £92 million hit from a cyber attack simply because they were running an outdated 17-year-old operating system. Every single one of these catastrophic failures could have been mitigated or entirely avoided if they just had the proper risk frameworks in place.
So, to make sure you don't repeat these blunders in your exam case studies, here is our roadmap for today. First up, we'll unpack enterprise risk management, or ERM. Second, we'll categorize strategic versus operational risks. Third, we're going to look at sector-specific legal risks. And finally, we'll wrap up with the dynamic risk continuum.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Enterprise Risk Management, and why it goes way beyond just mere compliance.
Okay, here is a massive exam tip for you to remember. Risk is a board-level strategic issue. For decades, companies thought of risk as just, buying insurance against fires or floods, just operational box ticking. But today, effective risk management has to be woven directly into the organization's strategy and overseen by the board. Let's look at the Costo Framework's definition. They define ERM as the culture, capabilities, and practices integrated with strategy setting and performance that organizations rely on to manage risk in creating, preserving, and realizing value. The absolute key takeaway here is that last part, creating and preserving value. In any exam scenario, every strategic decision needs to be viewed through the lens of, does this destroy stakeholder value, or does it actually enhance it?
Now, think about the relationship between risk and reward. It's like climbing a mountain. As you aim for higher expected performance, which we usually measure in cash flows or profits, your risk profile inevitably climbs right up with it. There's a sweet spot in there, a target. An organization has to deliberately decide which specific combo of risk and reward best matches its risk appetite, right at that target. If you just blindly push for maximum performance without aligning it to your actual risk appetite, well, you're practically inviting a Lehman Brothers-style collapse.
So how do you actually make ERM work in the real world? Costo lays out a few underlying keys to success, and definitely write these down because they are highly testable points. First, you've got to start at the top. Board support is completely non-negotiable because they set the tone for everyone else. Second, ERM has to be integrated into the actual culture of the company. It can't just be bolted on as an afterthought. Third, don't just sit there listing random risks. Focus initially on your top strategies and business objectives. And finally, don't overcomplicate it right out of the gate. Start with simple actions and build incrementally.
To perfectly illustrate that start-at-the-top principle, let's look at a real example. Back in 2016, the CEO of Lululemon actually stepped down because he fell short of the company's standards of conduct. Their executive chairman, Glenn Murphy, hit the nail on the head when he said that protecting organizational culture is one of the board's most important duties. Basically, if your board and your CEO aren't personally embodying the right ethical tone, your entire ERM framework is going to crumble, no matter how pretty it looks on paper.
Moving right along to Section 2, let's break down strategic versus operational risks and how to categorize them for your exam.
When you're hit with a really complex scenario in your exam, you need to be able to instantly distinguish between a high-level strategic failure and a day-to-day operational hiccup. Nailing this grouping is the secret to a high-scoring analysis. So let's draw a clear line. First, you have strategic risk. This is top-down.
These are the risks that threaten your very survival. They're usually low frequency but incredibly high impact. We're talking massive external shifts like a brand new disruptive technology. Then on the flip side, you have operational risk. This is bottom up. These are your day-to-day disruptions driven by internal failures. Things like your people, your processes, your systems, or maybe a sudden local power outage.
Let's ground this in reality by looking at BP's actual annual disclosures. Their strategic risks include things like fluctuating global oil prices, major geopolitical developments, the massive transition to a lower carbon economy, and high-level cybersecurity breaches. Notice the pattern here? Every single one of these is external, massive in scale, and threatens the core business model itself. They require the board to step up and navigate.
Now, contrast that with BP's operational risks. We're looking at process and personal safety, drilling uncertainties, hostile acts against staff, and supplying off-specification products. These are day-to-day, on-the-ground execution risks. Remember that $18.5 billion fine we talked about earlier? The Gulf of Mexico spill wasn't some grand strategic pivot. It was a catastrophic failure in process safety. It was a purely operational risk that exploded into a company-defining strategic crisis.
Which brings us to Section 3, sector-specific legal risks, and the really eye-opening lysis case.
You know, risks don't apply equally across the board. A software startup faces totally different threats than a global mining operation. So we really need to look at sector-specific legal risks, which happen when a company fails to comply with strict industry regulations. Let's walk through the tragic case of Lysis Surgical Supplies step by step. This is a brilliant mnemonic anchor for your exam. Lysis manufactured hip and knee joints. Step 1. Facing stiff competition, the directors illegally tried to cut costs by switching to cheaper industrial-grade materials. Step 2. They compounded that massive mistake by actually falsifying their annual compliance reports. Step 3. The heartbreaking result. Those inferior joints deteriorated, causing severe infections, immobilizing patients, and even leading to deaths. And finally, Step 4. The inevitable fallout. Swift regulatory investigations and absolutely massive compensation lawsuits.
This Lysis case perfectly highlights why legal risk is astronomically high in sectors like healthcare. The penalties aren't just some little slap on the wrist. The fallout means massive litigation costs, severe regulatory sanctions like losing your license, total reputational destruction, and, please do not forget to mention this in your exam answers, the very real potential for the personal imprisonment of the directors involved. When you're dealing with health-critical products, the legal risk is absolute.
All right, let's pivot to our final section, the dynamic risk continuum and the absolute necessity of adapting to change.
If there is literally only one thing you take away from today, let it be this. The corporate world and the exam scenarios you're going to face are never, ever perfectly static. Risk management is definitely not a set-it-and-forget-it kind of deal. Imagine a continuum. On one side, you have a hypothetical, static environment where nothing ever changes. Spoiler alert, no business actually lives there. On the other side, you have a turbulent, highly dynamic environment where risks are shifting constantly. Tech firms usually live on the far right of this scale. But lately, even traditional industries are getting shoved into that turbulence by disruptors. Just think about what Uber did to taxis, or how the COVID-19 pandemic threw even the most well-established companies into a fiercely dynamic risk environment almost overnight.
So how exactly do these risks dynamically change over time? Well, it happens in two specific ways. First, you can have a change in probability. For example, the likelihood of mortgage defaults might be super low during an economic boom, but it absolutely skyrockets during a recession. Second, you can have a change in impact. Think about a warehouse fire. The probability of a fire starting might stay exactly the same all year round, but the financial impact of that fire, that is going to be far, far worse if it happens exactly when the prices of the stored commodities are peaking. Because both probability and impact are constantly shifting, management has to embed continuous, dynamic risk assessments at every single level.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from the high-stakes reality of ERM to the vital differences between strategic and operational risks, right through to the ever-shifting dynamic risk continuum. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought as you dive back into your exam prep. In a world full of unexpected cyber attacks, tech disruptors, and global pandemics, is your organization actually prepared for tomorrow's dynamic risks, or are you just busy trying to prevent yesterday's mistakes? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.